I am the editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, and I am so excited to welcome you to today's Broadband Breakfast live online for Wednesday, June 29th, 2020. I am in Park City, Utah, of all places. Actually, I'm up here for a conference, the Rural Wireless Infrastructure Summit, and that's been a great event. I didn't even know about it. I happened to be in Utah for several weeks, and I learned about this conference and came up here. So I'm sitting in the Summit Hotel here in Park City, but because we do this live online every week, we can have guests from around the country. This is at least the fourth. We've probably done more if we go back in time and look at all of the events, Broadband Breakfast Live Online events that we've done dealing with mapping, broadband mapping and broadband data. But this is the fourth that we're tracking. You can see links to all of these four events on the page for this event in particular. And I am about to introduce our guest that will be talking about this topic. But before I do that, I want to let people know that there are so many moving parts to the question of broadband mapping and data. In fact, today, 2 hours from now at 2 p.m. Eastern time, there will be a webinar that the FCC is leading. They asked me to tell you that, so I have told you that. So go to that, right? Because that's the horse's mouth, right? They will tell you how the system that they've built, and I think it's one or 2 days still. They're not accepting the data just yet, but they will be accepting data in the new broadband data collection system that has been developed. We all know about this, right? We've been talking about this for forever. Indeed, we had a whole Groundhog Day special on broadband mapping and why broadband mapping keeps coming up. Well, hopefully we'll get a little more clarity. And the three guests that I've got for today's discussion each come at this in a slightly different angle. So I am really looking forward to hearing each of their perspectives on the subject of broadband mapping data. Before, though, I do also want to give a shout out to the sponsors of Broadband Breakfast. We would not be able to do the programs that we do week in and week out without their support. And so really wanted to make sure everyone is aware of the efforts of Utopia Fiber, Broadband.money, Broadband Now, Lightbox, Ookla, Pinpoint Capital Advisors, Powerhouse Management, Positron Access, Samsung, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. We are so grateful to each of them for their support. Now, with that, last preview comment is, don't miss our event next week. We will be talking about the Digital Equity Act planning grants, and we're going to be drilling into the details of that 2.75 billion pocket of money that has a particular purpose within the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So tune in again next Wednesday, same bat time, same bat channel. And now I'm going to go ahead and open our view to all of our panelists. Very happy to welcome each of them into this discussion. We're going to be hearing today, and we'll hear in this order as well, from Bill Price of Lightbox, Dustin Loop of the National Broadband Mapping Coalition, and also Ryan Guthrie. And Ryan is a vice president at, I believe it's called Advanced Technology Ryan, tell me the official name of the company.
Advanced Technologies and Services. The ATS is easy enough. So you can
Very good. Okay, Advanced Technologies and Services, which has a kind of a unique approach and take on data and broadband data and measuring the data. Just one more quick word on Bill in particular. Bill is the Vice President of Government Solutions for Lightbox. He's kind of key for their broadband data and mapping efforts. And I got to know Bill from his work in Georgia and actually in Florida too. I don't know if you say that anymore, Bill, but he's worked in Florida and in Georgia on broadband mapping, and that's kind of led him on the journey he's been on. So really happy to have you back, Bill. And again, Dustin and I, together with Lai Olson, the director of Measurement Lab, were on one of Broadband.Money's Asks Me Anything about 10, 11 days ago. And that was a great event. So I also got a link to that on our program so that you can join in and see that. And Ryan, this is your first time with us. Ryan's the Vice President of Solutions Engineering at ATS, as just discussed. So let's turn it over to you, Bill. Tell us a little bit about where you see broadband mapping right now. And of course, we're in a different landscape from 6 months ago when you were with us before, because there's been a little bit of water under the bridge. Tell us how you see both the federal and the state landscape on this topic, Bill.
Sure. Nice to be here. Can you hear me, Drew? Okay. Cool. Well, yeah, I'm Bill Price, and I'm responsible to sort of lead the Lightbox effort to assist state governments to do broadband mapping. That's been our focus since I got here primarily. And my background prior to joining Lightbox was I did broadband programs and mapping for the state of Georgia, and prior to that, Florida. And prior to that, I was an internet service provider long time ago, far away. Anyway, so Lightbox, the focus at Lightbox since its inception over 20 years ago has been location data, which is an essential component to broadband mapping. And Drew, what we've seen since we started down this state broadband mapping effort down to the location level of completeness and accuracy is that most states appear to be waiting, at least from my vantage point, rather than taking advantage of the planning funds to go do their own data collection and their own mapping. They appear to be waiting to see how well the FCC does. A bunch of states are doing their own mapping. They are issuing RFPs. We're supporting a couple, and others are supporting some, and some are trying to do it themselves. So, right now, government, for the first time in my lifetime, is faced with an enormous amount of investment money to jointly invest with grant applicants in broadband expansion projects, which are infrastructure projects. So it's really, mapping should, if done well, should inform and ensure that the money you are investing is being used most effectively to expand the service to where it's not. I mean, that's, at the end of the day, it's an investment decision-making tool, bottom line, right? And what happens is once you actually have a map and you have the data that's behind the map, which is just the visualization of the data, the location data, and whether each structure is provided a speed or not, 25/3, 100 down, 20 up, whatever. Once you have that, I mean, you're going, all the states are either running now since COVID or going to run more investment rounds, grant programs, you would call them, right? Where you have applicants come in, they see, or get the data of the unserved locations, the ones that are eligible for money. They put together a, preliminary design and a bill of materials, and they cost it out based on where those locations are and how many there are. And they submit that, right? And so then the government goes through a review process and decides which ones to jointly invest in. So you're going through this investment decision process in the program, in the operation of the program. And then because government needs to run on transparency and be honest and, provide citizen input and overview of what they're doing, they're typically, allow for challenges to the underlying location data or challenges to the grant applications themselves, because at the end of the day, if there are inaccuracies, whether intentional or not, you want to make corrections. So Drew, you get there with the data and the map, and then you start your investment round program, and then it's a back and forth, push and pull, tug of war, not a tug of war, but, a correction process, so that when you finally say this project is awarded, right, and we're ready to sign a contract, right, you're good to go. And you can actually start, putting the money out there, and the network can get built and the service is delivered over the next few years, right? So we're all facing, all of us, we're facing this very challenging. I mean, it's a new thing for, really for government to be in the seat that it's in, right? So everybody's having to learn a lot really fast. You and I went through this during the stimulus era where we had to learn a lot really fast. But that's kind of the high level, kind of where I think where I think we are. And the FCC is about to release its first version of a national fabric of location data and the broadband determination, which is a massive undertaking, and everybody's going to have to see how well it is, and they'll have to refine it, improve it, and fix problems and gaps and accuracy issues over time, just like anybody else would. But a state is faced with a decision. Do we want to just solely rely on what they tell us is true, or do we want to, spend a relatively small amount of time and money to get our own data so that we can verify it and have greater confidence that, number one, we're getting the funds that we should be getting, and are we really deploying them and tracking them most efficiently? So thanks.
So no, this is awesome. And I want to just take a minute or two to kind of drill into a couple points here. One is that, you've referenced the fact that, we worked obviously in different states. You were in Georgia, I was in Illinois on this first version, let's call it the 1.0 version of the National Broadband Map. Lots of problems, lots of errors. I think the most fundamental one was the block. If one person a block is counted, then the entire block is counted. And obviously going to an address level approach to broadband mapping, which is what this fabric is all about, is kind of finally, hopefully, gets you out of that problem, because we're going to definitively say yes or no to every serviceable location in the country. Is there broadband of a certain caliber and quality there? But this is where it gets interesting. The map that was built in version 1.0 was kind of the states aggregated up. That's not the approach that's being taken this time around. This time around, the FCC is going to do this national map, and it's going to be challenged down below, right? So, for example, I was at Mountain Connect about a month and change ago, and Phil Weiser, the Colorado Attorney General, he was talking about a number of topics, but when he talked about broadband access, he drilled in on, this is one of the most important things that Colorado can do, is to actually fact check the map, to basically have their own map so that they can check and cross check, if you will. And so, Bill, you've worked with, Lightbox has worked with multiple states, Georgia, Montana. I assume there are others as well. Tell us a little bit about the thinking that you've observed the states have for the reasoning they have as they want to check the federal maps that are coming.
Yeah, all of them are one, they have money now, right? And they're doing grant programs now. They're investing money now, right? And so they want to get it right. They really do. Right. So getting it right means having better, specific, data about the locations, the structures. You don't want to provide money for silos. You don't want to provide money, for empty sheds. Right. When you're distributing this money, you're investing it. Right. And so they care about, are we being effective with the money we have? And they're doing it. Right. So they care. And so they, are doing, they want to do location level mapping. And then they're keenly aware that there's a lot more money coming, the 45 billion BEAD money coming, that they're going to be responsible for, right? And so at the end of the day, the elected folks who answer to the citizens who put them in office, the governors, the legislatures, their constituents care that, if they're not getting service, they're going to get it, right? They're also aware that there's a lot of money coming. So, it behooves everybody from the elected folks down to the staff folks who are trying to do their jobs, to make it happen and, successfully, right? That they get this location level of accuracy data to make these investment decisions, Drew. And so, yeah, you're right. Texas is going to do it. Wyoming's going to do it. Idaho's going to do it. Nevada, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, Massachusetts, Colorado, all those states are in play and, working on location level broadband mapping. The thing that sort of makes me scratch my head in all this is why are so many states not taking any action when it takes so little time and so little money to go do this? I don't get it. They're doing themselves and their citizens a real disfavor by not acting. I don't know whether it's an education thing or I don't know, Drew. But we're attempting to raise awareness nationally, right? That you can do this. It's not that it doesn't take that much money or that much time, right? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, this is good. We're going to talk a lot about this, and thank you to all the attendees. The questions are pouring in. We're going to have a lot. Let's just get Dustin and Ryan into the conversation, then we'll start on these questions. So Dustin, would you mind telling a little bit about Marconi Society and the National Broadband Mapping Coalition and your take on what's going on with this FCC mapping process at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Drew. I'm Dustin Liu, Program Manager with the National Broadband Mapping Coalition. And the coalition is a group of practitioners that have been brought together alongside researchers, advocates, technologists that care about and focus on the collection and mapping of data related to broadband availability, adoption, usage, as well as network performance measurements. And the work of the coalition is really aimed at driving toward an ecosystem in which the decisions that we're making around broadband funding and other aspects of infrastructure planning and digital equity planning are made based on reliable data that is open, transparent, and verifiable. And so we want to see these processes that are put into place established with as much transparency as possible. So what this kind of translates to in terms of how we're thinking about the FCC mapping process and how it's likely to play out or potentially may play out. I think it's kind of helpful in breaking it down into three things: what we kind of know now, what we don't know, and then based on what we don't know, what would we like to see emerge from that? What we do know is that we'll likely see we're being told that we'll likely see the FCC maps coming out around November-ish, and that these maps will be used in determining how some of the funds within the BEAD program are allocated, and thus have a big consequences for how much different states will have to serve the unserved and underserved locations within their jurisdiction. And so when these maps are made public, that will launch this challenge process that will create an opportunity for individuals as well as governmental and other entities to challenge the accuracy of these maps. And so this challenge process is going to play a critical role in how these funds are distributed. And then we also know that once these funds are distributed to the states, states are responsible for developing their own challenge process in their initial proposal to the BEAD program, and that the NTIA will be reviewing and making modifications to these proposed challenge processes as needed. And even once the state level challenge processes are in place, that the successful challenges that emerge from that process will also be subject to the approval of the NTIA. So what we don't know is what these processes will actually look like. So if we're talking in terms of how we're thinking about the FCC challenge process, we need more clarity on the types of evidence and supporting information that will be allowable in their challenge process and how those can be submitted through the open challenge portal that they'll be setting up. We also need to know how the evidence that they accept will be evaluated in terms of establishing the preponderance of evidence standard for consumer challenges and the clear and convincing evidence standard for the governmental or other entities that challenge the maps. How these evaluations are carried out and how they differ will be critical to the whole process. And then just in terms of logistically and procedurally what this looks like, once the challenges make it through this process, there are opportunities for the challenger and the filer, in most cases the provider, will have an opportunity to try to reconcile those discrepancies. In the case that they are not able to reach an agreement, then the challenge goes to FCC review to determine whether or not the challenge is ultimately successful and whether or not the authoritative maps that the FCC have will include the data from the provider or the data that was being submitted in the challenge. We don't know how differing methodologies and data collection methods will be evaluated against each other. There are likely to be situations in which the challenger has collected or is providing data that may not directly align with the collection method or methodology used by the provider that's rebutting that challenge. And so, in addition to that, we also have to take into account the processes that the NTIA may establish, or the guidelines that they may use in working with the state's development of their challenge process. So that's kind of what we don't know what those things will look like just yet. And so I think what we would want to see is that those processes are developed in a way that's very open and transparent, and that they take into account the different processes that are already in place, and that there's coordination across not only the NTIA and the FCC, but also the states, as well as the communities at the local level.
Sure.
That have been collecting this information already. And we can get into later what we think is a good, sound methodology and approach to collecting this data, but I'll stop there for now.
Well, and a lot of questions, of course, on this challenge process, right? Because we're going to see it full-fledged. There wasn't really a very sophisticated challenge process in version 1.0, right? And all indications are that's going to be different this time around. But let's hear from Ryan Guthrie to tell us a little bit about your take on this. And in particular, let's not forget that in addition to, of course, these maps, these address level or service address level maps that are underway by the FCC, there are other programs, right? That kind of rely upon data. There's the Reconnect program of USDA and others. And I think that there are requirements. I know there are requirements on service standards, and I know that's something that your company ATS works on. So Ryan, tell us a little bit about that and sort of your independent view of this whole process as it's playing itself out.
Sure. Thanks, Drew. So my name is Ryan Guthrie. I'm the Vice President of Solutions Engineering here at ATS. Just kind of quick background on ATS. We've been around for 26 years, 27 years, started in 95. I've been here about 16 years. Always been in the telecom broadband space, working network assurance, revenue assurance, big data analytics, crunching, call detail records, IPDRs, heavily involved with regulatory support with USF traffic studies. And over the past couple of years, we've been working closely on the USAC's CAF program for the Connect America and ACAM program. So we actually were invited. I went down to DC a couple of years back when they were first putting this program together for the testing requirements, and they were looking for some recommendations on how do we do the testing and how should we collect the data and formatting and that kind of stuff. So we've been pretty heavily involved from the beginning on that. So we've been working with those customers over the past year and a half or so who have got that CAF funding, CAF2, ACAM, who had fiber, some of them are WISP, some of them are cable, to fulfill those testing requirements. And all indications are that the same testing requirements that they put in place for those programs are going to be the same testing requirements for these upcoming funds and RDOF and BEAD. The recent NOFO indicated that they were going to follow those exact same testing requirements, which were pretty extensive. So those companies who had to do it this past 2 years were really pretty surprised when they had to. When they first applied for that funding, they didn't know they were going to have to spend some of those funds to run speed tests and run latency tests and maybe buy some equipment, buy some software. So, that was a surprise to them, and a lot of them weren't all that thrilled about it, as you might expect. But going into this now that they've announced it ahead of time, you can start to allocate those funds and say, okay, I'm going to put aside, I know it's going to cost me X amount to do this testing, so I can kind of allocate that now ahead of time, which is nice because you can use the funding to pay for the testing as well. And so we've been working through a lot of issues with those customers, sort of related to mapping, but what happens when a customer says, no, I don't want to be part of your testing? You have to go back into the hub portal and ask for a new customer. And then if they say no, or somebody moves, somebody disconnects their service. Right? So there's a lot of issues that come along with that. And then when we run the speed tests, we have a hardware and software platform that we use to actually run those speed and latency tests, which again are pretty detailed, and they run for a week every quarter. And you have to run them for a few years. There's really no end date in sight for when that testing is gonna complete. And we see a lot of performance issues with quality assurance, right? With the speed and latency, what happens if you don't pass? If you don't pass the CAF requirements, they actually withhold funding. So it's very important to these ISPs to make sure they do pass. So when we run these tests and we find that they're below the thresholds, they come to us and say, well, what are we doing wrong? Where's our problem? Is it in our last mile? Is it in the middle mile? Right? We can only control really so much. We can lay that fiber to the house, but once we hand it off to the next provider, it's a little bit out of our hands. And the FCC, when they came up with the testing requirements, said that you do have to test to some outside location. So you can't test to a data center that's on network, because then you're really only testing your last mile, not your middle mile. Right? And I see some questions that have come up in the chat there about testing. So I'll try to address some of those at some point, but some of those are those speed tests that are state-run speed test servers right now aren't going to meet those requirements for the federal funding, because those are really more last mile tests than whole network tests, right? The customer running a speed test to your close server at your ISP is only testing that connectivity. But when a customer is downloading Netflix or watching, playing games, whatever it might be, that's going well beyond your network, right? So then you got to make sure you have enough capacity going to the middle mile and all that kind of stuff. So one thing the FCC did a very smart job of with the CAF and USAC, which I suspect they'll do the same with the BEAD and RDOF funding, is they allowed 1 year of pre-testing before live testing started. So when the order first came out a few years ago, that pre-testing period was not built in. You went right into live testing and it counted. And they decided to build in this kind of 1 year buffer.
Right.
First year of testing, you have to run your tests, you have to submit your results, but if you don't meet the standards, we won't dock you right now. We won't keep any money, but it's kind of 1 year to get your testing platform in place, work out any kinks, all that kind of stuff. And that was really a smart move by them. And I see that probably going to happen going forward with the next testing. But there's a lot of questions around it, right? So that was run by the hub and by USAC, but when it comes to the state, right, the NTIA is going to push the money down to the states. So who's going to have to maintain that? Who's going to be the administrator? Is it going to be the states, federal? So a lot of questions there.
Ryan, you've raised an issue, or you referenced something called the hub. Okay, could you just explain the hub that USAC runs, and how, from what you understand, that's different from the effort that the FCC, its basically parent entity, with its development of the broadband fabric and broadband map.
Yeah, so Bill touched on that earlier about the government and being kind of new to this whole process. And really, FCC is pretty new to this USAC and hub process as well, because collecting that much data, mapping data, and then collecting test data and all that and aggregating it was a whole new thing for them. But the hub portal, some folks on this call probably have hub portal logins already, because maybe they're part of those other funds. But essentially, it's a portal online that USAC manages, where you can go in and you upload your locations to there. So you say, I got this type of funding in this study area code, and here are my 500 active subscribers in that area. And when you upload those 500 active subscribers, then USAC says, okay, out of those 500, here's a random sample of, say, 50 that you need to go and run speed and latency tests from now. So that they give you that subset of customers to run the test from. You don't get to pick them on your own. And then that module is the same way, where you also go and upload your results at the end. So once you run your speed test, you go back in there and say, okay, here are the results from all my speed tests.
So thank you for that additional context about hub and USAC. And so we truly have a cornucopia of questions here, and I've tried to assimilate and ask them, and we'll have this dialogue here. I want to just and I have not myself had a chance to go and look at this test data that the FCC has had available, and obviously they're going to have a webinar, as I mentioned at the top of this call, in an hour and a half from now. So don't miss the FCC's webinar laying this out. So David Hunt asks, we were told that preliminary data was just for practice and not supposed to be accurate. I just started looking at the final data in one area, and it may even be worse. Now, by final data, we're not talking about data that's been collected yet, because that's what's happening beginning tomorrow or the next day. Providers are going to provide their data according to the new broadband data collection methodology. So have either of the three of you kind of played around yet with this, the test data that's out there? Do you have any reaction to David Hunt's question here?
Well, Drew, you know this, you never get done with the data, right? You're always working to improve the accuracy of the data, right? So there are companies like ours that's our entire focus of our business, 500 people, 20 years, location data, accuracy, improving it, bringing in other data to make sure the points you place on the structures are accurate, but you're never done completely, right? And of course, there are going to be gaps. I mean, every local government, every state government knows that there are counties, poor counties, right? The rural counties, the unserved counties, the accuracy of their property information, the accuracy of their addresses is, it becomes less and less accurate the poorer they are, basically, because they don't have as much money to invest in making sure the local data is correct. And so what happens is you have to find other kinds of data to improve the accuracy. Like in our case, we use GPS tracking foot traffic to calculate and predict, is that structure a residential structure or not, kind of thing, right? So doing this on a national basis is a massive undertaking. They haven't done it before, and they're somewhat hamstrung because, like the census, because of federal law, won't release data that would be helpful, right? I mean, it's been a complaint. All of us in the mapping business, we know about the historical complaints about, some kinds of data can't be accessed and used for broadband mapping purposes. So they're a little bit crippled in getting this done, but and so they're hoping that the ISPs will help them improve the accuracy, which is why they put out the preliminary data, for the ISPs to get a look at, right? Once the fabric itself is available for states to download, right? I'm certain that we and states we support and others will be downloading the initial fabric, and we will try to validate, and compare what's their data showing and what's, our efforts data showing, to determine, well, what's the difference in the location count, right? Because if you think about it, NTIA has to make an initial decision about how much money a state gets based on the FCC's mapping results, based on how many broadband serviceable location counts there are, how many residential locations, how many business, right? And so they got 45 billion And if you think about it, if you said, well, each location is worth $2,000, well, every 1,000 off is worth $2 million, right? I mean, this is really going to come down to real money, state by state, right? So, yeah, I mean, we're anxious to download it, evaluate it for accuracy and gaps. We would expect to find differences and gaps. So the question becomes is how big are they, right? And are they big enough? Are they big enough to enter into a challenge process, which is another complete set of work itself, right?
So there's a number of comments, and thanks, Bill, for providing links to the maps in Georgia and Montana. You mentioned Idaho, plans to do location level, but hasn't started yet. What is the state? And let's drill into this, not just Bill, but the others. Like, what is the state going to be able to do in terms of specifically saying, nah, this data is wrong, right? How will it use a state level map, or how do you envision, Bill and others, the fabric data being ingested into state maps, or just checked against using a state map? You want to take that? Does that make sense, Bill?
Sure. Well, back when we started the location mapping in Georgia, we came up with a methodology and approach, right? And we shared all that with the FCC staff beginning in 2019. We shared how we were doing it, the approach, the methodology, the results. And then when the Broadband Data Improvement Act was published and voted on it, we were happy because the same methodology and approach was written in the BDIA, right? So shapefiles, address lists, fabric, all of that was great because it was like our efforts in Georgia were not, going to be wasted, right? And then, Lightbox, when I joined, I mean, our approach basically when we go to a state to do location mapping is the same methodology, same approach, same effort, create a fabric, the fabric data, what's typically in location data, addresses, parcel information, lat long points that are on structures, identifying structures that are broadband serviceable and ones that are not. So, for when the FCC publishes its challenge process to either the fabric or the broadband results, right? Two different challenges, right? So the BDIA, like I say, they had to provide a challenge process to both, right? So I would be surprised if they don't come out with rules about it that says if you're going to challenge ours,
right,
then the format of your challenge data, because this is a data challenge now, right? It needs to be pretty consistent with how our data is formatted, right? So if you're a state and you've hired like Lightbox and we use the same methodology and approach, the data is going to be very similar, right? And just like the FCC is doing is they're ingesting over 1,000 ISPs data showing where they can serve at these speeds. Well, we do the same thing at state level, right?
Right.
So
right.
then you integrate it. You work with the ISPs daily, weekly basis to correct it. And then you determine the served and the underserved and the unserved, right? That's what you really determine at the end of the day. You got these three fundamental data sets.
Yeah.
So in an adjudication process, hopefully somebody independent, will, compare the two and render, an objective decision, right?
Let's get Dustin and Ryan's take on this point about data challenging and address level locations as well as the state observations. Dustin and Ryan, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I guess to add on to what Bill was saying, in addition to the states having access, also local governmental entities and tribal entities will have access to the fabric as well. And I think not only is it useful for them to look at that from their own local perspective, but also would like to see states making efforts to coordinate with the localities to, make sure that they're aware that this is something that they have access to, and work with them to review it. Because the closer you get to your home, the more knowledge you have about what the reality is, right? So somebody outside of town here might look at that and say, well, that's actually a chicken coop, and they might say, well, there's homes here, you just can't see it because it's covered by trees. I'm out here in Western Washington, so that could happen if you're relying on that type of data. But Yeah.
Just help me clarify the dumb question, right? I mean, can anyone go and look at the fabric, or do I have to be a state or a locality or someone who's already, submitting data?
My understanding is that it's available to those that are filing in the system, as well as governmental entities.
At some point, there's going to be challenges where individual people or communities are going to say, no, this is ludicrous. There's no service at this level for this. How is that going to be done? If we're, I mean, again, I'm asking you this, Dustin, because I know that's a key point of the National Broadband Mapping Coalition, is to have an openness to the data, right? How are we going to be able to see the data?
Yeah, Bill, do you have more? I'd ask if Bill might have more context.
My understanding is that Drew, from a mass scale perspective, really ISPs and state governments are the ones who can request and gain access to the collection system for the purpose of either contributing their data to help the FCC effort, or putting in a challenge, right? So you're uploading an entire state's worth of fabric and broadband serviceable location data if you're going to mount a challenge into their system, right? I don't believe local governments have that option at this point. Could change, I suppose. I don't think citizens will have access to it. I mean, they are sourcing their data, the fabric data, from commercial sources, and there are limitations, license limitations, in terms of who can get what data for what purpose, right? This is not an open data scenario where anyone can just download all the data for their state or for their county or whatever, right? It's just illegal, right?
Right.
So citizen input, I'm sure they'll provide some facility, Drew, just like a lot of states do, where, if you run a speed test and I'm not getting what people are telling me I'm getting, or your map shows, Georgia's map shows that my address is served at 25.3 or faster. Well, it's not. And here's my proof. I mean, typically they want to facilitate input, from individuals, from citizens, to help them over time, right? Now, no government is staffed to deal with, millions of one-offs. I mean, or just one-off, I mean, so they're going to do the best they can. And I'm sure they're going to facilitate some way of input and corrections. I mean, everybody wants to get it right. Everybody wants to correct mistakes.
We just haven't seen the details on how this will play out yet. And so good question for the FCC in the webinar in an hour and 20 minutes.
Just
Justin,
one thing real quick.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point to, I'm unclear still on like the consumer individual access, but I will say the public notice that was released on June 23rd, announcing the availability of the production version of the broadband serviceable location, does say that there's a process for state, local, and tribal governmental entities. So I do believe that based on that there is access for the local and tribal governmental entities. Let's wanted to clarify that.
No, thanks for that little bit there. William Rubin has two questions. Let me use this to pivot to Ryan here. William asks, can you describe the different mapping techniques that states are using for per location broadband mapping, speed test, service provider data, others? And then he follows up, consumers can do the speed test from a downloaded app on their device at a specific location, and then they can report the results from that location to the state for use in the state development in its broadband map. I don't think the answer to that question is yes, but I want to hear Ryan's take on this data for speed tests, since you do it so much, Ryan.
Right, sure. So unfortunately, I don't have too much on the mapping side of it to contribute, but on the speed test side, I have seen some pretty cool state-run programs where you can go in as an individual and run a speed test, like you mentioned, and then upload that data. You can say, I'm at this address and I'm going to run a speed test right now. And that does get mapped on there. And a lot of that information is public. If you go to some of those, I saw someone sent one or two links in the chat there to some of the state broadband maps there. And the only thing I'll say about that is that most likely those speed tests are overstating the speeds that the customers are actually getting. So my point before about that middle mile, last mile, right? So if I run a speed test and I'm running to a state hosted server, I'm really only testing pretty locally, right, within my state. So I might be showing a faster speed that I'm actually getting when I go to watch Netflix, or I go to play a video game, I go to do any of that, because those are going outside of the state. They're getting handed off to other long haul providers. So, the speed tests might not, they might not show everybody who's really underserved, because they might show higher results than those customers are actually experiencing. And when it comes time to do the real speed tests that USAC wants, and for all these different funds, like I said, those definitely have to go outside of the state.
Right. So Ryan, is there any talk or discussion or decision about the data that USAC collects on speed tests being incorporated into this broadband data repository, so to speak, that the FCC is in the middle of collecting?
I'm not sure if they're going to include it in that. It's definitely going to have to be part of it going forward. So once everybody gets their funding and they roll out the fiber and they turn up the customers and they have to do the tests, they're going to have somewhere to collect all that data. And that's what I was mentioning before too. It took them a while to build up this hub, something they call a PMM module. It took them a while to build that up and allow ISPs to upload their data and download and upload and all that. So I suspect that they're going to have to assist the states in providing that same service for the BEAD and RDOF programs, because it'll be a huge undertaking to say to every state, okay, you have to develop this whole platform where your ISPs are uploading their locations, and now you have to pick random samples, and you have to track that for them and collect the results and all that. It's a big undertaking.
Oh, absolutely. Tammy Mestro, WSBO, makes some points about the Washington State speed test and highlights it as a consumer-driven test that, while it doesn't require a download app, works right from the speed map. The results are displayed on a state map that can drill down to the premise on the backside, but not on the public-facing side. That's very, very interesting, right? And what do the three of you think of states doing speed tests? Obviously, Dustin, obviously we talked with Measurement Lab, which facilitates a huge number of speed tests. Ookla also, likewise, perhaps even more, large numbers of speed tests. These kinds of data, they either can be seen or they can be gotten under different terms. And so, like Dustin, for example, how can we coordinate, synthesize, and or fact check data about speeds that's coming from one source, whether it's Washington State or MLab or Ookla, with the FCC repository here?
Right. So speed tests are a very useful tool, but also a complicated one. Ryan was mentioning that they might overstate the speeds, and in some cases they might understate the speeds, right? There are a number of biases that might be built into those speed tests. For example, proximity to the primary access point within your home or your router, whether or not you're connecting by Ethernet or over Wi-Fi. Some people take a speed test because they're upset during a time of poor network performance. There was even one that Yi mentioned when we were at Mountain Connect, especially for WISPs, like you're microwaving a potato, and that interferes with the connection coming in. So there are some things outside of the ISP's control that can certainly impact and skew those results. So as we think about the different implementations that we're seeing, again, both at the state and the community level, because a lot of communities are running similar speed tests that can be used in the process as well. It's hard to know exactly how to recommend the structure if the goal is to provide a accountability for the FCC data when we don't know all the specifics of the challenge process just yet. That being said, there are steps that those implementing these speed test surveys can really take to develop a more robust methodology and get more reliable results out of this. And so just thinking about the browser-based speed tests for now, one recommendation is to add set of brief instructions for those that are coming on to take the test, to ask that they hardwire their connection when possible, and recognizing that a lot of modern devices do not have Ethernet ports. In the event that you are unable to do so, please move as close as possible to the primary router in the home so that, especially if we're talking about speeds like 25.3 or 120, that wireless connection is unlikely to be the bottleneck if you are in close proximity. And also, make sure that you don't have 4 other people on Zoom calls and playing online games and streaming movies and etc. And there are additional ways in which a robust methodology can be put in place. I know it's not always feasible, but there are different methodologies between Measurement Labs NDT test and Ookla's speed test that capture different metrics and measure speeds in different ways. And so, we recommend this. We're working to hopefully with an entity to hopefully provide a tool for this, but an ideal speed test survey would capture results from different tests, because that could give you a sense of like consistency and trends that give you a better idea of where those issue areas might be with a little more certainty.
Yeah, lot of great comments and questions, and we'll get to them. But this point that was made by Dan Smith about, I don't see adequate public access to the new FCC maps if only carriers and state officials, community organizations cannot effectively push for correction. So I think where this is going is a lot of questions on this challenge process. I also want to chime in on the timing question. There's been some back and forth in the chat on this, and probably best stated by Carol Maddie when she says that it's not likely that the FCC's challenge map will be done by this fall. They have committed to a map with data by November. So I think it's within the range of realm of possibility that they will meet their deadline and get a map by November. But in terms of a challenge, the post FCC challenge map, Carol notes in the chat, won't be available until 2023. I think that's clear. And then the challenge process will take multiple months. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this challenge question and how that affects the timeline for the maps and the IIJA rollout? Ryan or Bill?
I guess the question, Drew, is if you're a state and the FCC data informs NTIA and NTIA informs the state that your allocation is 150 million, right? 50 million more than your minimum, right? If the state doesn't have its own data, right? Well, what are they going to do? They just, all right, we'll take the 150 million and we'll run our own, we'll run our own investment program. Now, if you had your own data at that moment in time and you saw a difference, well, at that point, it's like, how are they going to treat that state if they say, well, we're really due 250 million because our data is better than yours? We'll have to see how it's going to be. It's going to be theater, right, and drama to see how it all plays out. And we can't really predict it or say what it's really going to look like until they publish, the specifics and the rules. And when we find ourselves in the theater at the time, right?
Thank you for joining. This is Tammy Maestro. I hope I got that right. She's with the Washington State Broadband Office, and we've just had such an engaging topic. I asked her to turn on her camera and address this particular question of how you, as a state broadband office, are addressing this kind of actual data in regards to showing the unserved in your state. Do you want to chime in on that, Tammy?
So our speed map is consumer driven. And one of the things that we are trying to do with that speed map is add questions like, do you have up-to-date equipment? Are you buying the highest level of speed from your service provider? These questions will give us a better idea on exactly the kind of information that we're getting. If we add that to our speed test, that will give us the opportunity to say, okay, and I personally, when evaluating an area for our projects come in, they are not for one house, right?
Right.
And so if one house in that area doesn't have the minimum speed, that doesn't qualify it as being unserved. I look at it as a whole area for the project and determine, if 80% of the people are on our speed map, a green dot, and I have to say, only 10% of our population has taken the speed test. And we're really pushing to have more people take it. So every time we talk about it, we're like, please take the speed test. So we can say we have a bigger amount of data to look at, but it's so true about it's, customer driven. It's their equipment, it's their service that they've purchased. These are things that are in our forethoughts about making sure that the data we collect is closest to real as possible, because I personally don't get the service that my service provider promised.
Well,
and I have good stuff. I mean, good equipment and great.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you for coming on for that. And feel free to stay with your camera on if you'd like here. I do want to ask Ryan a question. And this builds off something that Rick Uzzi asks. How do these speed tests take into account Wi-Fi if the end user is running it over their home network and the variability of that? And we actually had a whole section, our April event here at Broadband Breakfast Live Online talked a lot about in-home connections and some of the problems of using that. But I'm sure this is a question you deal with on the testing for Hub, Ryan. What's your reaction to that question,
Yeah.
Rick Uzzi?
Yeah, well, Dustin mentioned that too, right? Are you connected to Wi-Fi? Are you hardwired in? If you are on Wi-Fi, how close are you to that? So when it comes to the speed testing for these maps, that's very important. When it comes to speed testing, that you have to meet your requirements of speed testing to prove that you delivered those speeds, then it's all hardwired. So the equipment then the customer's not running the test. That's the thing when it comes to those speed tests, is we're running it or some other provider is running it. And so our equipment is hardwired in. So we know we're getting the best possible speed at that time, except for other factors such as crosstalk, right? And Dustin mentioned this too. How do you know that when you run your test at 8 p.m. that someone upstairs isn't watching Netflix and someone else is playing a game? So that and to his point too, when somebody goes to run their speed test, it's because they're not happy with the speed they're getting, right? They're saying, hey, it's slow right now. What's going on? Let me go run a speed test and see what I'm getting. And it's likely because other people in the house are doing something. So there's a lot of variability to the accuracy in those kind of home speed test results. Also, time of day, right? So, are you getting your speeds that you're promised at 8 p.m.? Well, maybe not. Do you get them at 3 a.m.? Yeah, maybe so. And then that gets into network congestion and how to address that. So,
and Sheila Richardson raised the interesting point as well, that there are those that subscribe to 25 megabits per second down, 3 megabits up, or more likely some other number. Those aren't often the packages that I see providers offering. When faster speeds are available and take the test, that is likely an affordability issue, which kind of raises the importance of not looking at any one element in a vacuum. This has been an extremely rich conversation. We do like to keep to our hour, although I'm often tempted to go a little bit longer. I want to give each of our panelists, including thank you for joining here in the middle of discussion, Tammy, a chance to offer some final thoughts, a minute or so, that each of you have about what needs to happen next. That is to say, what the FCC should be doing as it starts to roll out with its webinar today in 1 hour, what the state should be doing in their use of maps, what the NTIA should be doing in terms of allowing or requiring a robust challenge process, what local governments and citizen activists and nonprofits should be doing, i.e. fight like hell to get access to broadband data so they can do tests, and anything on the table. Let's hear from all of you, and we'll go Bill, Dustin, Ryan, and Tammy. We'll give you the last word as the state broadband official. Thank you again for chiming on at such last minute here. So go ahead, Bill. What are your final thoughts on this?
Sure. Keeping going with the speed test thing, in Georgia, we bought statewide speed test data, and we used it and for several different purposes. And speed test data has a place, but the problem with speed test data is that when you look at the rural areas and the really hardest to reach and the really unserved folks, I mean, they're not taking speed tests. And we put it on the governor's website. We promoted it in radio and Facebook. I mean, and every state that tries to use speed tests, they all run into the same issue, is because citizens have to self-opt in to do it, right? And you need them to do it more than just once, right, to establish a pattern. So you can't really do accurate location determination of broadband 25/300 out of 20 up, is it really at a specific location or not? You can get into the neighborhoods, like Tammy was talking about, and it's really useful and helpful to see in urban environments where you have lots of people and they're taking lots of tests. But when you get outside of that, there's a desert. I mean, during COVID, in the midst of COVID, we were desperate to try and identify student addresses that were unserved to use the money that we had, right? So we put full court press on. And we even went so far as to think, well, maybe we can get college students to go out, like task force and run speed tests, right? And we just couldn't make it happen. You've got to have enough speed tests in an area just to look at it from an area. But even then, MLabs and Ookla, they will tell you their speed test data is not location specific. It's not structure specific. So if you're looking at investing, hundreds of millions of dollars, I think it's a mistake to think that we can wisely and objectively achieve our goals to serve these unserved locations if we just rely on speed tests. Speed tests, I think, are good for follow-up once you've made an award to see if these new locations are actually getting the speed that you paid to get them. I think they're useful in that regards. When it comes to going forward, what should everybody do? Well, make sure citizens are, doing what they've always done, which is letting their elected officials know what their results and feelings are, because it does affect them, and things do happen in legislation, state legislation. States do take action based on enough citizen input, right?
Right.
State governments have the opportunity now, as part of the pre-BEAD program, they can, put in a budget for planning dollars, $5 million. And, my message is, hey, for, a really small amount and a couple of months, you can get your own program going and get your data, your state location level data. There's no reason, there's really nothing prohibitive about it.
Right.
So I think everybody should look at it and consider, going after doing location level mapping like a bunch of states are doing now. That would be my advice, Drew.
Wonderful advice. Thank you, Bill. Let's hear from Dustin, Ryan, and then Tammy.
Yeah, so kind of just to close, what we need to get is, as we think about the challenge processes that'll affect the allocation, we need some more information and transparency around what those processes will look like. And in designing those, would absolutely urge the FCC and NTIA to do so in not only coordination with each other, but those at state and local levels that have already been putting significant resources into collecting this local data to ensure that these things, to the greatest extent possible, can be used together to get a better collective understanding and actually get the resources where they need to go. And then agree with the at the community level, just to touch quickly on speed tests. Certainly agree that there are limitations. I would say that they are useful from our perspective in identifying trends. And great point. A lot of people that aren't able to take the test because they don't have the connection at all. And so in these communities, rural communities, underserved communities, unserved communities, need to get a little more creative. And that involves often working with the local community institutions that know how to get creative and reach people. That might be radio ads. That might be working with the local libraries, local schools to send stuff home with the students. And I've even seen in some of these surveys, in lieu of being able to take it online, providing people with like a 5-digit text message survey so they can say, hey, we don't have survey. Okay, or we don't have service. What's your address? And that helps get to those communities. So I would encourage a more locally tailored approach.
Great point. Great point about bringing the local back in. Ryan, close out thoughts for all of us.
Sure. So I'll kind of keep the speed testing conversation going, but so the speed tests have their place, they have their challenges, they're important when it comes to this mapping, but all the things we talked about, right? There's a lot of variability there. But for all the ISPs here who are getting the funding, think about the speed tests are two different parts, right? There's speed tests when it comes to your mapping, and then there's speed tests that you're going to be required to do once you roll out your service. And those are a whole different animal. Those aren't, hey, Mr. Customer, can you please go on Ookla and run a speed test right now? Those are very defined, a week of testing, certain hours a day, upload, download tests, latency tests every minute. There's a lot to do with that. And you'll have to have a service, or if you have your own group that can do it, but most likely you have to hire an outside service to actually do that testing. So when you're going for your funding and you're allocating that money, put some money on the side for speed testing once you deploy, because for sure you're going to have to do it, and it's going to cost a few dollars to be able to do that.
Thank you, Ryan. We'll give the last word to Tammy Mestro of the Washington State Broadband Office.
Thank you, Drew. I wanted to agree with what Bill said, that the speed test has to be evaluated as just a tool. And you need to have a full toolbox in order to make the evaluations to who gets the funding. The speed goals for the state of Washington is every citizen in Washington, 150 symmetrical by 2026. Not an easy thing to do if you aren't looking out in the rural areas for those one-offs and those places. So I also agree with Dustin and what he said about outreach. I have personally given my business card to people in person at conferences and said, if you have people that don't have access to broadband in their home, have them call me. I will put their address in our speed map. So we've tried to do that. We have a group in our broadband office called the BOG. It's the boots on the ground team.
BOG, I love it.
Yeah, we are actually coming up with ideas on ways to get outreach about the speed test out, so that, again, our data is, it's a little tiny piece of the picture. That speed map is a little tiny piece of the picture. And I would encourage any state, it's good information. We can also have our contractor run a feasibility study for us based upon a project that is submitted as an application. They'll tell us, we asked them for 8 criteria, are there any ISPs there that look like they will probably challenge because they're saying that they are in that area, right, or any of that kind of thing. We have criteria that meets that feasibility study comes from that map, and it is very helpful for us in making determinations. So,
well, once again, this has been wonderful. Thank you to our audience for bearing with us for a few more minutes as we wrap this all together. On behalf of our panelists, Bill Price of Lightbox, Dustin Loop of the National Broadband Mapping Coalition, Ryan Guthrie of ATS, and our impromptu guest, Tammy Mestro of the Washington State Broadband Office. I'm Drew Clark, Broadband Breakfast. See you next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. Take care, everybody. Bye.